So we're in Acts. We're exploring, we're learning. How did those who first started following Jesus, not just in Jerusalem and the area of Galilee, but from around that world of the Mediterranean, throughout the Roman Empire, how did they start to view faith and understand what it means to be a community of faith together? We're going to continue on with this series for the next few weeks and sort of see how that turns out for them and think about what that might mean for us. As we've been reviewing so many stories in Acts, what people are experiencing, the situations they're facing with each other, the encounters they're having with a wide variety of people, and also their experience of God, what is your story? What is there in your experience, in your family's history, that you've reflected upon or that you've learned things from? My mother's father immigrated to Canada from Ireland when he was an adolescent. His family came over as a group. They're a fairly large family, about 7 or 8 children. I should know that. 7, I think. And they came at a time when there wasn't really a definitive cure for diabetes. And so my great-grandmother had been diagnosed with diabetes, and the best that the doctors in Ireland could say was, how about a change of climate? And so the story I've been told is they flipped a coin between Australia and Canada. In retrospect, I could have had a really cool accent, but here I am, and thankful to be here. As time went on, they homesteaded in a little just outside of a little village called Williamsford. Is a log cabin, literally a log cabin. Kathy and I spent a couple nights on our honeymoon at that little log cabin that was owned by the family. And they started to become established within Canada. When I'd be told the story of the Kennedy family, it was always interesting to me what there was of this, connection with Ireland. I was quite curious, and I would often be babysat while my mom was working as a nurse and would spend time with my grandmother and granddad. Unfortunately, my granddad had a farm accident when I was about 5 years old, which resulted in a brain injury. And so he could only speak in one-word sentences. So he'd have to pick his word really carefully to try and communicate what he's doing, and then I would do the work of trying to fill in the blanks, of trying to understand what it is that Granddad was communicating with me. So he found it very difficult to talk about Ireland. But sometimes Grandmother would tell me some of the stories. There was someone in the family who decided to do the genealogical research. And so apparently they actually traveled to Ireland and then to Scotland, looked up baptismal records, found citizenship records, found immigration records. And what they discovered, they decided not to publish. They discovered that our branch of the Kennedy family had been sort of exiled from Scotland for stealing horses. And they decided that wasn't something they needed to share as sort of an official publication in the family history. I thought it was sort of cool and kind of amusing that this is, sort of my family's history. My high school friends, when I learned about this, asked me where I got the horses that we had on our farm, but that was fine. That's all part of the mystique of having that family history. As I grew older, I started to work for a denominational office, and one of the pastors, her name was Betty Puricelli Kennedy, and I knew Kennedy was her part of the name. And so one time when I was calling her, she was pastor of a Spanish-speaking church in Toronto. I called her up and I said, Betty, you and I have something in common. My mother's maiden name was Kennedy. First thing she asked me, oh, are you of the Scottish Kennedys or are you of the Irish Kennedys? Because I'm from the Scottish Kennedys, and the Irish Kennedys stole horses from my ancestors, so we kicked them out of Scotland to Ireland. I immediately apologized for any of the horses my ancestors had stolen from her ancestors, and the conversation carried on. As many of you know, our oldest son and his wife live in southern England, and so often when we've flown to visit them, we would fly from Toronto to Dublin, and one occasion we were able to take a side trip up into Northern Ireland where Granddad was from, and I was able to stand in one of the fields where my granddad as a child had stood. And I've never really considered the significance of place or geography or like pilgrimage, any of those kinds of things. I've always sort of felt I am where I am and God is with me where I am. But there's something significant about feeling those connections and understanding what impact that's had on your story. So as you think about your personal history, your family history, how does God connect with your story? What's in a name? When Kathy and I were expecting our firstborn, we started into imagining what possible names we might have for our children. Now, I grew up in Grey County, close to a town called Durham. It's a one-stoplight town. It's about 2,500 people. And I grew up going to the Royal Bank, and if I didn't have my banking number on me, they would say, that's fine, what is your name? And I'd say, James Watson. And they'd look at their records and they'd say, okay, what's your middle name? James William Watson. Explain, there's 5 James Watsons here in our records, so we need to clarify things. Give them my middle name, and then they'd ask, okay, what's your address? Is it a rural route address? So, a bunch of people have rural route addresses at that time. Okay, what's your birth date? This whole thing of being able to identify who I was, because there's so many people in that area that had the same name. So I was one of those parents who had this burden I needed to pass on to the next generation of, okay, it'd be nice if you had a unique name, something unusual. And so we did discuss some names. We settled on sort of Isaac as a first name. We liked sort of the biblical linguistic connection to laughter. And that has rung true through Isaac's life. He's someone who loves to laugh. Did not think through in my career as a minister the fact that there's also some really difficult parts to Isaac's story that you then encounter in a new way when you're reading through the biblical text. His other name is James. It comes from me. It comes from my father's middle name. It's sort of a family name. And so in Kathy's family, there were 3 given names. So I kind of had one name to work with of what could be sort of unique. And so in an attempt to help me, Kathy started suggesting some of the names of friends they'd had in Nigeria. That from a Canadian context, from a European background, maybe these would be sort of unique names. And she's going through some of the names of people they'd known when they lived in Nigeria and came to Athanasius. And I said, yeah, that one's great. At which point I think Kathy was feeling like, oh no, how are people going to understand this name? And at that point we hadn't decided which would be a first name. And I explained, well, Athanasius was this guy in church history, the bishop of Alexandria in Egypt. And he was someone who's known for helping people sort out, how do we talk about God? And came up with sort of a way of talking about God as Trinity. And then shared that with people. And he was someone who lived simply at a time when bishops might have golden thrones up at the front of the congregation. He chose to live among the people, to live simply. And he advocated for a theologically, biblically coherent understanding of God. One of the stories that's told about him is that he needed to get word to the emperor in order to get some of these things set out. And he was getting kind of blocked by some of the people around the emperor, so hid by the side of the road, and as the emperor's going by on the horse, jumped out and grabbed the horse, and then had his conversation with the emperor of Rome. I liked that kind of audacity, his willingness to both be simple and to be out there, and so I latched onto that name. The fellow named Athanasius in Nigeria is someone who was a student of my mother-in-law at the Teachers College. He's someone who maintained contact. He appreciated a number of her reflections on the Bible as she taught religious studies in the Teachers College, and they maintained a friendship over time. Athanasius was someone, when we would have communication, he'd say, oh yeah, I'm leading a prayer group in my church. And so we sort of knew to ask a few more questions. Well, tell us about your prayer group. Oh, it's about 500 people. When there was conflict in his city, as there sometimes is in Nigeria with the different cultural and religious differences, he was someone who would rally people to say, hey, let's not let this affect our neighborhood, and would reach across to others and invite them to be part. He offered services to people with disabilities. So he worked in schools for the blind and schools for the deaf, and at one point was running a microloans program for women who had hearing impairment so that they could actually have a source of income. So he's someone that we greatly admired in terms of things that he had offered to his community. It was funny, the one time he came for training to the United States. So he worked with an agency called Mennonite Central Committee, and they brought him over to do training, he and his wife Rautha, to do training with like Americans and Canadians who are going to be traveling to Africa. So they brought in African leaders to help explain to the North Americans, here's ways in which you can be culturally sensitive and aware as you go to Africa, which I think was very wise. But they did a side trip to Niagara Falls, and so we were able to meet him there. And it was so much fun for him to meet his namesake, our son, Isaac James Athanasius Watson. And anytime afterwards, whenever he would communicate with my mother-in-law, he'd never ask how Isaac was doing. He'd always ask, how's Athanasius? Our poor son, as he grew older and starting to school, his complaint was, Dad, I'm never going to be able to spell it. It's too long. He did learn how to spell it, and eventually I felt a little bit redeemed when he went to Redeemer College and actually studied the writings of Athanasius. So I felt a little bit of parental justification in our choosing the name. It's been interesting to watch who has identified with Isaac because of his name. Early on, when we were getting bank accounts for our children, our banker was of Greek background, and when he was reading the names of our children, he said, Athanasius, that's a great name. He was so pleased, that one of our children had this name. So what's in a name? This morning I'm going to, in this chapter of Acts, look at two cities that both have the same name, Antioch. There's Antioch, which is in what would be modern-day Syria, sort of up the coast of the Mediterranean from Jerusalem. And then there's Antioch Pisidia, which would be in what is modern-day Turkey. Fair bit of geographic difference, but in that day and age, some of the rulers, people in power who had the authority to name cities, sometimes chose family names in the hopes that they would be preserved for all of posterity, which did work. Here now, 2,000 years later, we're still talking about Antioch. The first Antioch we're going to talk about from the scripture is the Syrian Antioch. This is a place where you may remember when people were being persecuted in Jerusalem for following Jesus, they started to disperse out to other areas to avoid being placed into custody and to jail. And Antioch up the coast was one of the places that they went. And so a Christian community started to form there. It's actually recorded in the Bible as the first place where people were called Christians. Now, in the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers. Barnabas, Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who'd been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work which I have called them." So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. So this is a church that was praying in support of Barnabas and Saul and sending them out to share with others who Jesus was and what that meant for people's lives. When the biblical commentators, when the scholars look at linguistically those names, it's a multicultural group of people of different backgrounds, and a socioeconomic class difference between them. The one gentleman, both his name, but also little added text there about being brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. So that was a practice at the time where someone who was being brought up in a noble household who was going to be a ruler would be given a friend of the same age group. This is someone who'd grown up in the court, grown up with Herod the Great, who was the father, and had been a companion for Herod, who became the Tetrarch for some of the regions of Judea. This diversity of people really only had one reason to be together, and that was Jesus. And I think this is an important part of this story to remember as we read what comes next, and as we reflect on what it means to be the church in such a globally connected world. So Barnabas and Saul, who later his name shifts to Paul, they were sent out. They were given sort of the prayerful support of the people at Antioch and told, you are being invited by God to go and share this story with others. So they went to a few places on their way to Pisidia in Antioch, which again is over by modern-day Turkey. In verse 14 it says, "From Perga they went on to Pisidian Antioch, and on the Sabbath they entered the synagogue and sat down. After the reading from the law and prophets, the leaders of the synagogue sent word to them, saying, 'Brothers, if you have a word of exhortation for the people, please speak.' And standing up, Paul motioned with his hand and said, 'Fellow Israelites and you Gentiles who worship God, listen to me.'" This is one of those moments. They're in a new place. They found the synagogue that exists out in this diaspora of the Jewish people. And they know that they're talking to both people who've grown up as Jews and those who've grown up outside of Judaism, who have expressed an interest in learning about the one Creator. So when we're telling the story of how God has been at work in our world, how God has been at work in our lives, how we've observed God at work through the pages of the Bible, where do we start? For Saul and Barnabas, they started with identifying where people were at. Saul recognized that this was a group of people who knew the story of the Bible. They knew the Old Testament, sort of the lives and times of people that are recorded there and how God interacted through history. And they're invited to speak in a synagogue where the expectation was that you would teach from the scriptures. And so that's where they started. Paul knew that these were people who either understood themselves as being people of God or were quite intrigued and were interested in what it meant to follow this one God as opposed to the plurality of different gods that existed in the Greco-Roman culture. So, Paul offers a quick history lesson. from God leading Joseph in Egypt and then Moses leading him out of Egypt to King David, who is a high point in Jewish history, and whom the people of Roman culture would probably be able to relate to in terms of the emperor currently having that kind of prestige and authority. And then Paul tracks forward the ancestry of King David to the descendant of Jesus. Paul invited people into the story to see what their connection was, to understand how God was at work in the world as they understood it. It's always interesting to me to hear where people start in telling the story. I think I may have told some of you before that there's a fellow that I worked with in the Salvation Army out in Vancouver named Michael, and he was just a people person. I would be at an outdoor cafe sitting out by the sidewalk, and someone would just walk up and start talking to Michael off of the street. And our conversation would be interrupted, but Michael would just love having this opportunity to connect with someone else. Sometimes they knew him, sometimes they didn't know him, and they just start up conversations with him. And one of Michael's passions in life was telling other people the story of Jesus. And I was walking through the streets of Vancouver with Michael, and he said, "The Bible provides us with so many opportunities." At the time, there was a refugee crisis, and Vancouver was receiving a number of the refugees. And he said, you can start up a conversation with someone who's escaping a war-torn circumstance by talking about, wouldn't it be amazing to be in a world where the lion lies down with the lamb? What would it mean for us for that to be actualized? And then talking about God's desire for shalom, for a peace that encompasses all of people's experience. He said, or as I'm talking to the young urban hipster crowd, I don't even know if hipster is currently a current term, but talk about where do we find meaning in life when so many people are searching for direction and meaning in so many places. And then he could enter into conversation about conversations Jesus had with people, what it means to find meaning, discover meaning. So where do we start? With someone who's experiencing loss? With someone who's suffering? Is it just sitting with them? Letting them know that we're present? Letting them know that we're praying for them and acknowledge that suffering is real. It's not something God desires, but God will walk with us through our suffering. For those who are feeling alone, to acknowledge that God actually actively seeks out relationship with us, wants to be with us, wants to walk with us on our steps through our journey of life. It's helpful as we go through our days to acknowledge the situations where we've been invited to tell something of our story. And to also invite others to tell us their story. Paul doesn't leave it as just sort of a broad description of what has happened through history. He makes these connections, helps people see that God was speaking to people then about who Jesus is now. And then he proceeds to talk to them about what this can mean in their life. So to repeat verse 38, which was read for us this morning. Therefore, my friends, I want you to know that through Jesus, the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. Through him, everyone who believes is set free from every sin, a justification you're not able to obtain under the law of Moses. They knew that God was holy. And they knew that there's ways in which, in this life, mistakes are made, directions are taken that should not have been taken. People can be harmed. But this was the new news, that through Jesus' forgiveness of sins, the ability to be set free from those mistakes, from the weight that they carry, and live life in that freedom. I think the language of justification is very important here. It's not something that we can self-justify or make completely right on our own, but God provides a way. Offering forgiveness for small things is sometimes kind of easy. Canadians have a bit of a reputation for saying the word sorry. I was talking with a young man who'd immigrated to Canada from South America, and he said, oh yeah, like when I first arrived here and I was working on a construction site, the supervisor took me aside and said, hey, just say sorry and say thank you, regardless of whether you need to. It'll help you. It'll help you when you're working here. We're used to saying sorry or saying it's not a problem or think nothing of it, almost as a reflex. But accepting forgiveness can sometimes be harder. It's having that humility of recognizing that something has gone off track and being willing to own up to it and take those steps towards reconciliation, towards freedom. There's a freedom in being extended a hand or a loving embrace and knowing, okay, we're good. The relationship is sound. And that this relationship will outlast any challenge or hardship that we may be facing now or in the future. So as you think about your story, your family story, your history, how has God connected with who you are? I really enjoyed last Sunday when we had a meeting after lunch to hear people talk about what they saw as value and the experience of each other at First Baptist Church. There's so many people, when they shared their story, it was about experiencing care, experiencing acceptance, being welcomed for who they were. And I was so pleased to hear that. It's so encouraging to me personally. Thank you so much for everyone who shared. What are those moments that you recognize where God has been at work? You've been given that invitation to step forward in relationship. That's the invitation we have in life, to walk with Jesus, to talk with Jesus, to not walk alone through this life.